That's, not what Mr. Foreman says, Marty. He says you came into his store, stuck a gun in his ribs, and told him to hand over all his cash.
No, he's got me mixed up with somebody else.
He picked your picture out of a mug file.
So, you ever see a mug shot that looked like a guy?
We're not depending on the mug shot, Marty. Mr. Foreman is coming down here to look at you in person.
We've really got you this time, brother.
This is Talkback. Our drama for this program is called The Victim. Our guest is Dr. Robert Moon, minister, First Methodist Church, Fresno, California. Later, Miss Lisa Sergio and Mr. Merle Emery will be asking Dr. Moon questions raised by our play.
Come in.
I've got Brevik outside, Lieutenant.
Any trouble?
Not too much. When I entered his room, he reached into this. Never got a chance to use it, though.
Nice going, Travers.
He had a lot of stuff in his room. Radios, silverware, jewelry. I sent a wagon over to pick it up.
Maybe Mr. Foreman will be able to identify some of it. He ought to be here any minute. Put a label on this and send it down to ballistics.
Right away, sir.
Well, how do we play it this time, Marty? The easy way or the hard way?
That's all a mistake, Lieutenant. I tried to tell him, but he wouldn't listen.
Okay. Where were you last night at 9 o'clock?
9 o'clock,
9 o'clock!
Oh, yeah. I was out for a walk.
Where?
No special place, just around the neighborhood.
Around Foreman's gift shop?
No! I was never near the place.
That's, not what Mr. Foreman says, Marty. He says you came into his store, stuck a gun in his ribs, and told him to hand over all his cash.
No, he's got me mixed up with somebody else.
He picked your picture out of a mug file.
So, you ever see a mug shot that looked like a guy?
We're not depending on the mug shot, Marty. Mr. Foreman is coming down here to look at you in person.
We've really got you this time, Brevik. A gun, a house full of stolen goods, and an eyewitness. We've waited a long, long time for this.
Well, enjoy yourselves while you can. Because you're going to find out pretty soon that you're wrong.
Lieutenant, Mr. Foreman's outside. Oh, good. Coleman, Peterson, Lang, McHenrick, let's have a lineup.
Hello, Lieutenant.
Hello, Mr. Foreman. Now, I want you to look at these men and tell me if you recognize one of them. Now, take your time.
All right. I've never seen any of them before, Lieutenant.
Are you sure?
I'm sure.
Mr. Foreman, you picked a photograph out of a file last night.
Well, last night I was excited. I was upset. It was just a few minutes after the holdup.
And the gunman's face was fresh in your mind.
I could have made a mistake.
Mr. Foreman, I risked my life apprehending that man. Doesn't that mean anything to you?
Take it easy, Travers. Will you come into my office, Mr. Foreman?
Certainly.
Can I go now?
I'm not going anyplace, Breivik. You're staying here.
Well, you don't mind if I call my attorney, do you? I think they got some kind of a law against holding a man without evidence.
Barney, take this guy to a phone. A pay phone.
Okay. How did they get to you, Mr. Foreman?
Get to me?
Marty Brevik's pals. Did somebody phone you? Whisper to you on a crowded bus? Did they send a note through your window with a rock?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Mr. Foreman, I've been in this business for 20 years. I know the signs of fear in a man. I see you're married. 2 children, 9 and 14. What can I tell you, Mr. Foreman? They won't make good their threats. I wish I could tell you that. We never know what they'll try. Sometimes they bluff, sometimes they don't. In any event, we'll give you all the protection that's humanly possible.
You mean policemen in my house taking my children to school?
If that's what you want.
That's not much of a life.
No, sir, it's not very pleasant. But what's the alternative? Letting Marty Brevik go? That won't change things much as far as you're concerned. You'll still be a threat to Brevik as long as he's afraid you may change your mind. No matter what you do, when you leave this building, you're in danger, Mr. Foreman. That's the truth.
Why? Why did this happen to me? It's like a nightmare.
You didn't ask to be held up. It happened. We can't change that. But we can change the future. Do you want the future to belong to Marty Brevik or to us? When people like you are willing to stand up to the Breviks, we won't need cops to take our kids to school.
I don't know. I want to do the right thing, but I don't know.
Why don't you go out and have a cup of coffee? Think it over. And maybe we'll talk some more.
All right.
Mr. Foreman.
Oh, yes?
Did you have a nice talk with the lieutenant?
Yes. Very pleasant.
I assume your memory's been refreshed.
I'm not sure I know what you
I mean,
mean.
you've agreed to sign the complaint against Brevik.
Well, no, not exactly.
You haven't.
No, not yet. I'm going to think it over.
Mr. Foreman, would you come with me for a minute? I'd like to show you something.
Well, all right.
Now you listen, mister, and listen good. You looked at some people just now, and you recognized one of them as the man who held up your store. Am I right? Am I right?
Yes.
That's a good start, mister. That's a real good start. Well, I got a complaint here made out against Marty Brevik, and you're going to sign it, right?
I haven't decided.
Well, I'm going to help you decide. Now, whatever you're scared of Brevik doing, I'm going to do worse if you don't sign this complaint. Do you understand that, mister? I'm going to get this signature tonight. Now, sign.
No.
Well, I guess I'm going to have to give you a little more help in deciding.
What's going on?
There's your complaint against Brevik, Lieutenant.
Get into my office. You all right, Mr. Foreman?
Yes, I think so.
I can't tell you how sorry I am this happened. I'll tear this up if you want me to.
No. No, don't tear it up. What it says in there is the truth. I should have signed it when I first came in.
You just take it easy. I'll be right back. That took a lot of intelligence, Travers. I guess you're proud of yourself.
You signed the complaint, sir.
Travers, how long have you been on the force?
12 years.
And in all that time, has anyone told you whose side you're supposed to be on?
I'm on Mr. Foreman's side.
And how do you explain what happened just now? And don't tell me he fell.
Let's face some facts, Lieutenant. Now, if Foreman hadn't signed that complaint, Brevik would be out of here in less than an hour on a habeas corpus. Would that be better?
I happen to think that Foreman would have signed without coercion. He was half convinced when he left this office.
Well, half convinced is not convinced. I've seen it happen too often, Lieutenant. Sure, they know how to call a cop the minute something goes wrong. Let the cop get killed. That's what he's supposed to do. But the minute Mr. John Doe has to go to a court and point his finger at the guilty party, his mind becomes a mysterious blank.
Foreman had a reason to be scared.
We all have a reason, Lieutenant. We had a reason during the war when we had to crawl out of our holes and go charging toward an enemy pillbox. Some did it because they were brave. And some did it because they knew there was a sergeant behind them with a gun, ready to shoot the first man that turned back. And that is what Mr. Foreman needed tonight, a sergeant with a gun behind him.
That's quite a theory, Travers. Follow it out, and the average man would be afraid to walk into a police station. We've got to work with men like Foreman. Patiently, honestly, fairly. We've got to make him see that doing the proper thing is to his ultimate advantage.
He'll never see it, not as long as he's more scared of them than he is of us.
Luckily, you don't speak for most policemen. Starting now, you don't speak for any.
Suspension?
You'll be notified by the Departmental Hearing Board. Turn in your pistol before you leave.
All right, Lieutenant. But remember this. Marty Breivik, gunman, hoodlum, potential killer, is now behind bars because of me. No matter what you think of my methods, it was me who got Foreman to sign that complaint, not you. Goodbye, Lieutenant.
Dr. Moon, at the end of our story today, we are reminded by Sergeant Travers that it was his methods that put the man behind bars. It was his methods that got the complaint signed, which indicates to me that he feels the ends justify the means. And it was a pretty good demonstration, but is this always true?
It was a demonstration not of ends justifying the means. It was really a demonstration that his method had gotten the goal that he had in mind. But this does not mean that the community is safer because he used this method.
Well, this is true, but he pointed out to this Mr. Foreman with violence that there was nothing to be afraid of. This man was afraid before he was whipped. After he was whipped, he was not afraid.
He was given a choice of two fears: to be done in by the gang behind the boy,
This is not a responsible way for a police department to behave, is it? If the police department's effectiveness is dependent upon its making the citizen more afraid of the police department than they are of the hoodlums, then the community is in a constant state of tension and fear.
But this was not the intention to make him afraid of the police department. Was this not an intention to show him that it wasn't as bad as he thought it might be? Because this man was soundly whipped. And after it was over, he wasn't afraid.
But remember, he's not through being whipped. He still has to face the hoodlums.
Is it not a fact, Dr. Moon, what you're really saying is that you cannot fight one evil with another evil, no matter how you dress it up? Violence is violence.
Violence is violence. Evil is evil. And as Jesus said, you cannot use Satan to cast out Satan. If we're going to use an unethical means, an unethical tool, an immoral method, the end result is bound to be evil also.
You would agree with the lieutenant, with Deems, who deprived him really of his gun and fired him.
I do agree with Deems. I believe that the lieutenant was using the proper approach, that he ought to give Mr. Foreman an opportunity to make the decision without coercion. It's an immoral thing to apply coercion like this upon a person with the hope that he can make a moral decision that way. It's not a moral decision if it's made as a result of physical coercion. It's a decision based on fear. What else the lieutenant did is another matter. I believe he still has a responsibility to try to prepare his policemen, his police officers, so that he's able to minister to his community in another way.
Well, isn't there such a thing as talking to people in a language that's the only language that they understand?
This is echoing, of course, a familiar slogan of our day that force is the only language that the enemy understands. And the end result of this, Merle, is 50 megaton bombs to answer 50 megaton bombs, and then 100 megaton bombs to answer 100 megaton bombs. If force is the only language the enemy understands, then we're all lost. It seems clear to me that force seems to be the only language that we understand when we use a slogan like that. It means that we have not been resourceful or creative enough to conceive of some other way to meet evil, except with more evil.
But was there not also involved here in this man, in Mr. Foreman, a good motive behind his initial fear? It was not that he liked the criminal. He didn't enjoy being held up and have his things stolen. He was thinking what? Of his responsibility to his children. He was a man caught in a terrible dilemma. Is my responsibility to my children, who were threatened, obviously, or his wife, or his house, or his family, or to the citizenry as a whole, where he was really throwing the danger out because you let the criminal go loose? Isn't this also a very serious problem that we face, not irrelevant to the broader one at world level?
Not at all irrelevant. It just shows that we face dilemmas when we face moral questions frequently, and he does have a responsibility both to his wife and children and to the community at large. But it's the responsibility of the police department, at least the police department, to help reassure him as far as they're able about their ability to help insulate him from the threat and danger. They may not be able to do it, but this is the risk which he takes along with the police department.
And that the community can be protected without the police having to resort to violence, which is the method of the very criminals they are trying to apprehend.
That's correct.
How would you go about bringing this point of view to bear on people, police or otherwise? It's not only the police who do this sometimes.
Perhaps we ought to identify who some of the others are that do it. It at least, doesn't it? It becomes very clear in what I referred to a moment ago as the 50 megaton bomb versus the 50 megaton bomb. Our whole obsession with the military approach to solving international conflict is another reflection of this tendency of ours to think that we have to use an evil means in order to conquer evil.
But you raise an international point that is, of course, very clear in everybody's mind. On the other hand, you see that the unarmed people, like Mr. Foreman, he was the neutral, the victim, but also the neutral. The unarmed people are very much impressed, and whoever has more of this force cows them. Well, they don't like it. This is frightening.
Isn't it conceivable, though, that the unarmed among us may be more impressed with this force than are the armed?
How do you mean? Explain this. This is very interesting.
I mean this, that isn't it at least conceivable that Jesus was right, that if we would choose a good means with which to face evil, if we would respond to hatred with love, if we would respond to violence with gentleness, that we would find a more effective way to communicate even to those, and especially to those, who are willing to use what we consider to be unethical means.
I would agree with you, but I think you would find a great many people who would say yes and be bombed out in the process, or murdered, or whatever.
Yes, inevitably this is true. I'm moved to speak here about another matter that I believe is related to this, and that is the tendency of the anti-communist crusaders in our day to be very open about their willingness to use communist techniques, for example. It is the communists who have openly said that they were willing to use deceit and lying and violence. This is almost an exact quotation of Lenin's words. But here in our time, we've witnessed some of the leaders of the anti-communist crusades in our midst, using almost exactly the same language, that if the communists use lying, that we too must be willing to deceive. So that we're using the communist techniques in an attempt to defeat and counter communism. And I believe when we do this, we are not going to conquer them.
Well, you're giving them a victory because...
Oh, sure, we give them the victory in the sense that we become like them.
we prove that their method is the only one that there is, and we have none other to resort
If we do this, we are already lost. They have already won.
Well, what would you do to pull us away from this very dangerous brink of a precipice on which we find ourselves? You've put your finger on a very, very key...
Are you referring to the
problem.
brink of the precipice with respect to war, or to meeting the communist challenge?
To losing our own morality,
Losing our own morality,
principles,
yes.
in an effort
Yes.
to win for them.
Isn't the responsibility upon those of us who have perceived another way and have learned from Jesus that there may be another approach to this, isn't the responsibility upon us to try to place in the hands of ourselves and of our neighbors other weapons, other methods that we believe are consistent with Christian teachings?
What are some of these other weapons and other methods?
One of the first things that we must be able to do, of course, is to disarm ourselves of arrogance. This tendency of ours to think that the evil is always out there in the other person, the other nation, and not in ourselves. And to disarm ourselves of provincialism that tends to make us think that the sun rises and sets so that the crops will grow in our gardens and we don't care what happens to the rest of the world. And disarm ourselves of a dependence upon these other weapons that can't help but lead to great tragedy, perhaps to the destruction even of civilization, at least to the destruction of our democratic heritage. And then it seems to me we might be able to rearm ourselves. After we've done this, we might be able to rearm ourselves with generosity and goodwill and an ability to see the other person's point of view more clearly.
Well, now, Lieutenant Deems had the strength to combat the apparent success of this violence that his fellow police officer had used. He had the strength and the courage to go ahead and to suspend him from duty, despite their friendship and his length of term on the police force. Now, how do we convey this type of strength to a nation of people when they see the apparent success of this type of violence?
I wish we could have seen in the drama evidence that Lieutenant Deems had been able to communicate this to his police officer, who, though he had been on the force for a number of years, had not yet learned it.
Or if Lieutenant Deems had said, when the police officer said, well, it's thanks to me, it's my method, you've got the man now behind bars, Lieutenant Deems could have said, but if you didn't give me time. Because by his persuasion, the man might have signed.
But suppose that Lieutenant Deems had failed even in time to get the signature. Now, you and I believe that he would have. That is, we have confidence that Mr. Foreman,
yes,
who appeared to be a reasonable man, ultimately would have seen the reasonableness of Lieutenant Deems' approach. But suppose Lieutenant Deems had made this approach, and Mr. Foreman continued to be moved by fear of the hoodlums, refused to sign. This, it seems to me, does not prove that Deems is wrong in his approach.
No, nor that the resort to violence, such as was used by the
It
police...
still would not justify the resort to violence.
No.
It only means that perhaps we need to concede to Lieutenant Deems longer time, another opportunity, hope that he will find other ways to persuade Mr. Foreman, find other ways to reassure him.
If you were doing what it seems to me, we're all suggesting should have been done, that Mr. Deems should have been given time, and then, if the man wouldn't sign, why, you would have taken the risk of allowing that obvious criminal loose. And there would have been a risk.
This discussion isn't finished until you have thought through to your satisfaction the questions which Miss Sergio, Mr. Emery, and Dr. Moon have been considering. Perhaps you will want to continue to think and talk about the issues which Talkback is raising. Talkback is a public service program presented by this station and the churches of your community. It was produced in cooperation with the National Council of Churches as a contribution of the Methodist Television Ministry.